Capcom has really been on a roll when it comes down to remaking the Resident Evil games. When you consider the 2002 remake for the original game and the three most recent remakes, Resident Evil 2, 3, and 4, they pretty much hit a home run almost every single time. But my question is should we see Capcom remake the original game? And I think we should. No, don't get me wrong. I'm a huge fan of Resident Evil 1 Remake. Actually, it's probably my favorite video game of the franchise. But I can see why it makes perfect sense for Capcom to go ahead and remake this game. So my name is Ruben with NerdSpace, and I'm here to tell you my top 7 reasons as to why I think Capcom should remake the original Resident Evil game once again. Let's get it. So I think it's very important that the new players of the generation get to experience where Chris Redfield started. Where did he come from? Where was his beginning at? And I think starting a whole new Chris Redfield trilogy is the way to go. A lot of people have already seen teases from Resident Evil 4 Remake teasing a Resident Evil 5 remake. And I'm sure Capcom is also seeing that due to the survey, a lot of people seem to be pushing for a Code Veronica remake, which also features Chris as a primary protagonist of the game. But before we dive into those two games, it would kind of make sense for Capcom to want to start with Chris's start, his very beginning, his first ever game that started it all. Because I feel like the Chris Redfield trilogy is Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil Code Veronica, and then Resident Evil 5. Yes, he's in Resident Evil 6, but you know, a lot of us don't really talk about that game, and just about everybody's in that game, so let's be real here. But I feel like remaking the first game could actually introduce people to Chris Redfield that aren't familiar with him. Of course, people like myself, and I'm sure a lot of you guys that are watching this video, are pretty familiar with Chris Redfield outside of the Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 8 games. However, a lot of people's first interaction with Chris Redfield was in Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 8. And that has to do with the new generation of gamers out there. A lot of the new generation, the next generation Resident Evil fans, started around Resident Evil 7, and they haven't had the opportunity to explore Chris Redfield's backstory and where it all started at. And I think this is a perfect opportunity to introduce Chris's origins to the new audience by doing this remake. And not just Chris's origin story, we've seen Jill Valentine in Resident Evil 3 Remake. The new next generation of players got to experience her portion of the story already with Resident Evil 3. We saw Chris in Resident Evil 7 and 8. We saw Wesker now in Resident Evil 4 Remake. So we've seen a lot of characters introduced in some of the newer games from this origin game, from this original game. And this is a chance for newer players to experience Chris, Jill, and Wesker's origins all the way back to the original Resident Evil game. So number 6, I think about the boss fights, and I'm like, you know what? Even though the remake did a really good job at improving the boss fights, I feel like the remake of the remake could do even better, especially with the new graphics and the new mechanics in this day and age. So let's start by looking at the bosses in the remake. That was back in 2002. Most of the bosses were either easy, skippable, or pretty much just a cinematic event. So I'll go through some of the perfect examples I can think of. So first off, whenever you face off against the Yawn for the first time in the attic, you pretty much can just run beside the Yawn and escape without him even touching you. Then when you take a look at the shark, the Neptune, which looks to be a really cool, unique boss fight, all you pretty much do to end it is a cinematic cutscene dealing with doing specific switches and then running over to where the Neptune's body is at and pushing a generator into it. I feel like there's a missing boss fight, an actual interaction fight between this boss and yourself. But hey, it can end with the generator scene. I'm fine with that. I just think there should be more of a boss fight itself between Neptune and yourself. Another example I want to touch on is a new character that was added to the Resident Evil remake, and that has to be Lisa Trevor. Lisa Trevor is another very basic boss fight. All you do is push 4 stone pillars off a platform and she's pretty much done as well. And then even the second fight against the Tyrant is completely skippable if you do specific things in the story, which for the most part they can keep that for all I care, as long as they improve on the other boss fights. And that's what I want to see. I want to see the fights themselves be improved upon. I think that's honestly one of the weakest parts of the original and the remake, is that the boss fights just don't really feel that difficult. Ways they can improve these boss fights, well, I already mentioned with Neptune, make there be an encounter, an actual fight against him first before you enter the situation where you have to drain the lab and then push a generator to electrocute him. But I think one thing they do need to change is the final fight against Lisa Trevor. They need to make that a little bit more difficult and to actually raise the stakes. And I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me here, because a lot of people are kind of stalker enemy fatigued right now, but personally I think Lisa Trevor is the ideal stalker enemy. She was kind of sort of a stalker enemy at parts of the game, but it was scripted events. I think she would make a perfect Mr. X in the Resident Evil Spencer Mansion. I feel like that would be amazing. It would make things really, really scary and tense, and I get it. Stalker enemy fatigue is a thing in the Resident Evil franchise, but you guys have to admit that whenever you're going up against a stalker enemy, you are terrified and you are nervous, and it adds so much more fear to you when you're playing this game. So I think that's a missed opportunity. But I think Lisa Trevor as a stalker enemy would be a lot of fun. And then her final encounter, just make sure it's more of a fight instead of just pushing stone pillars, or make the stone pillars farther apart to where it's not so easy to end the fight, because you can literally end the fight in like 20 seconds. The last thing I'll mention is don't change the V-Jolt. I'm fine with it weakening the boss. I think that's a really cool puzzle from the original game. Maybe adjust it a little bit so it's not as easy to figure out for the veteran gamers like myself. But the V-Jolt is a big part of the original game. I thought it was one of the best puzzles, and I really don't want to see them get rid of that. I think it could be used to weaken it, but maybe get rid of the Barry saving Jill encounter, just so that way it's not too easy. I think that's probably an easy fix right there. But yeah, overall, I think improving the boss fights is a great way you can easily improve from the remake, and I can definitely see them doing it. They've done it once already before. They can do it again. You don't have to add new boss fights since we already have a good amount of bosses. Maybe add one in the attic to replace the yawn fight, but for the most part, I really like a lot of the bosses they have. They just need to adjust the fights themselves, and then you're perfect. You're set. So number 5 is actually a combination of two different things that I kind of think go well together, since they were both expanded upon with the remake already in 2002, but that has to deal with the new puzzles and the new locations they can add to another remake. I think by remaking this game, that's something that you definitely have to bring to the table, because that was something that Resident Evil 2 actually did. Resident Evil 2 Remake, I think the reason why people were so happy with it is that it actually added more to a game that didn't have much to it at first. It wasn't too much more. It was like, it was an orphanage that they added, and some other little areas as well. But overall, I think it could definitely use some more additional locations and puzzles with a remake of the 2002 remake. Some of the different things I can think of is that I've seen them add new puzzles like the mask when you're in a graveyard. That was really cool. I like to see them kind of expand on that a little bit more, maybe some other different types of puzzles, because one of my favorite things about the original Resident Evil game, and I think the reason why the remake is still my favorite Resident Evil game to date, has to do with the fact of how many puzzles there were in the game. I love puzzles, and I think that was something that I really enjoyed about the original Resident Evil games, and I would like to see them expand on that a little bit more so I can see that franchise I fell in love with back at the beginning. And while we're on the topic of the graveyard, that's something that they can expand upon a little bit more, because they added the graveyard to the remake because it actually wasn't in the original, and I thought that was really cool, but it still felt a little bit small. They can expand on that a little bit more. That's a very gloomy, scary area. I feel like it missed opportunity to not explore that a little bit more and make it a little bit more dangerous and terrifying just being there. And while we're talking about more locations, some of the fan favorite areas I feel like people want to see explored a little bit more are the tunnels and the labs, and even the woods in general. So the tunnels you don't really explore until you're actually heading down where you meet Enrico. That's where you actually explore the tunnels. I think that's a really small segment, and you do have a boss fight in there that I think is fine the way it is. So I really like that location. I think expanding on that just a little bit more would be a smart idea for Capcom. But specifically, the area I probably want to see explored a little bit more has to do with the woods. I think we don't get enough of the woods, and the woods is just a perfect iconic area to automatically bring tension and horror to. I mean, if you're in the middle of the woods at nighttime with no light other than the flashlight in your hands, I feel like that is a pretty good start to a horror movie, honestly. And I feel like that would help out a lot. That's an environment that Resident Evil, the original game, could jump into a little bit more Maybe even make the prologue at the beginning like playable. They don't have to, but they don't do that, then allow us to explore the woods a little bit to kind of see that tension. We kind of get a little tease at it when we're cutting through the graveyard and heading over to the cabin in the woods. That's a really cool element that they added to the Resident Evil remake back in 2002. But I would like to see the woods explored a little bit more, because I think that's a really horrifying experience that they can bring to the Resident Evil franchise with the Spencer Mansion. The fact that the Spencer Mansion is located in the middle of the woods in the Arklay Mountains, it's a missed opportunity to not force the players to kind of have to face the dark in the woods. And I think that's a really great location they can explore more upon. The list can go on as far as different locations they can add or build upon. You build upon the guardhouse, that seems like a really small section that was not expanded upon. You got the lab that we don't really spend too much time on. There's a lot of different locations you can explore and expand upon, or just add to the game. It's a huge mansion, and changing the layout a little bit is fine, but you have to do it the right way. That's why I think the woods is a great addition, because it doesn't really change the layout of the Spencer Mansion that everybody fell in love with, but it still adds more to the game. But let me know in the comments, what type of location do you want to see expanded or added to the Spencer Mansion? Okay, fans, veterans of the franchise, I know you guys are going to crucify me for this, but we all know that the acting and the dialogue in both the original and the remake, well, they're kind of rough, honestly.
It's a good thing you were wearing your bulletproof vest. Wesker, you've become senile.
Blood. A second late, you would have fit nicely into a sandwich.
Like, don't get me wrong, I love the cheesiness, and I do want them to carry over some of the jokes into the remake's remake. That being said, yeah, the acting and the dialogue can definitely use some work, and I think that's one of the biggest reasons why we do need to see a remake of the original. Because any new fans coming to the franchise, if they go back and play that game, they're probably going to be done within the first 10 minutes because of how cheesy it comes off. I swear it's like watching a B horror movie, and that goes for both versions of the game, because I feel like, and actually there's a YouTube content creator I want to give a shout out to that really said a perfect quote that kind of summarizes both of these games when it comes to the acting. I believe the name of the content creator is Arklay Archives, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But they specifically said that they like to think that the original Resident Evil game, the original one that was made, that the acting was overacted, that they were over the top, crazy overacting, and that the remake back in 2002 was underacted, where there was no emotion, no passion in the dialogue at all. And I think that's a perfect summary of each of these games when it comes to the acting and the dialogue. So I feel like nowadays, when you look at the remakes that we get now, the acting and the dialogue is so much better, but they still have teases and Easter eggs to that original dialogue. Perfect example is looking at the most recent remake, Resident Evil 4 Remake. One of my favorite scenes from the original Resident Evil 4 was that beginning scene where Leon makes that bingo comment.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
And we see that in the remake again. Even though the remake cuts down on the cheese, cuts down on the horrible dialogue and jokes, they still keep some of the Easter eggs of the original game, and I like that. And that's what I would like to see in a remake of the 2002 release. I would like to see them kind of do throwbacks, like maybe keep the Jill sandwich joke somewhere, maybe like reference it somehow, but just don't make the full game all cheese and corniness. Like, fix that, prove upon that. That's one of the things that Resident Evil Remake and the original game really struggled upon, was the acting and the dialogue. So number 3, I can definitely see people putting this as their number 1, but number 3 goes to the RE Engine's graphics. So if you don't know what the RE Engine is, it's pretty much the engine that was created back during Resident Evil 7. When they created Resident Evil 7, that's when they first started using the RE Engine, and basically that's when they started to do motion capture to get different face models and more reactions from different characters and stuff. And that's where you saw the huge improvements to the graphics, to the point where all of Capcom games now build upon on the RE Engine. And since then, the games have been gorgeous. Like, the face models have been amazing. The graphics have been mind-boggling. Like, it's such a good feeling playing these Resident Evil games ever since the RE Engine was introduced back in Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. And we've seen it a lot since. Resident Evil 8 Village, the remakes of 2, 3, and 4, all of them use the new RE engine, and it creates a lot more exciting elements to the Resident Evil franchise. One, it makes the atmosphere feel so much more immersive and horror based. Like, you can actually feel the difference between the Resident Evil 4 original game and the Resident Evil 4 remake. And I feel like Resident Evil 1 remake could definitely use that. Now, don't get me wrong, I totally agree that the graphics in that game are top notch for their time. Like, I think this is probably one of the best looking games of its time for sure. That being said, when you add the RE engine, you create more gore effects, you create more atmospheric experiences. Imagine walking through the Spencer Mansion with a lot more detail and more environmental aspects that kind of make it feel immersive, like really exciting just being part of the Spencer Mansion. And I think walking through the Spencer Mansion on the RE engine, which we've already seen fan games kind of touch upon a little bit before they got canceled, I think that is an experience that I would love to be a part of. So I think the RE engine, the graphics that it brings, the gore aspects that it brings, the tension that it could bring to the new atmospheric experience with the Spencer Mansion, I think that is a must-have, and I think that's one of the things I would love to see in Resident Evil 1 Remake, and probably one of the biggest reasons why I personally would be okay with Resident Evil 1 being remade again. Most of these things are mainly directed towards new game players who were not there at the beginning. This specific element, I feel like, leans more into someone like me, who is a fan of the franchise, who's been playing the franchise for so long, but would love to experience a Spencer Mansion and a whole new experience. I really think that the RE engine will bring a lot to the game, and I hope we do get to see that one day actually. So number 2 goes down to the modern controls for new gamers. And what I mean specifically about that is the over-the-shoulder mode. Now, I'm sure if you are a veteran of the franchise, you're probably hitting up that keyboard saying there is nothing wrong with tank controls. How dare you come after the tank controls? They are amazing for the Spencer Mansion. And I would agree with you for the most part, but the fact of the matter is that you are facing a new generation of players. You have people that are into the new Resident Evil, that came into the Resident Evil franchise because of Resident Evil 7 or Resident Evil 2 Remake. Those are the two games that brought the most people into the franchise. And when you think of those games, they don't have tank controls. Tank controls, unfortunately, did not bring new players to the franchise. And that's fine, except that we need new players to kind of be invested in this franchise in order for this franchise to continue on and for them to continue making these games. Which means tank controls cannot be the way of the future. It sucks to say that. It breaks my heart to say that, but it's just a fact. Tank controls are not popular by modern gamers nowadays, which is why I think creating modern controls with the over-the-shoulder mode and Resident Evil 1 remake is very important and very vital to get new players to play the original Resident Evil game. So many players, I can guarantee you this, so many people after playing the remakes and playing Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 8, they're like, I want to go to the start, I want to go to the beginning of it all. And they take a look at Resident Evil 1 Remake and they start that game, and between the dialogue and the acting and the tank controls, they probably get about maybe 10 minutes into the game and walk away and be like, nah, this is too old school for me. And it sucks to say that, but it's just a fact. So having the modern controls is just going to introduce more gamers into the Resident Evil franchise. And that's what we want. That's what we want as a community, because we want to see more gamers involved with this franchise. The more it succeeds, the more installments we get of this franchise. And I really enjoy this franchise. I don't want to see it go anywhere. And I think it's important for the new generation of gamers, the new people that are getting into the franchise, they need to be introduced to the first game that started this franchise, and that is Resident Evil 1. And I don't think it would be that bad exploring the Spencer Mansion with the over-the-shoulder mode. Think about Resident Evil 2 Remake. And guess what? That was over-the-shoulder, and you still had so many more horror moments added to the game that it didn't ruin the survival horror aspect of the Resident Evil franchise. If they can do it with that game, they can do it with the Spencer Mansion and Resident Evil 1 Remake. I truly 100% believe in that. And if they can pull it off, then we can see them going back to Code Veronica then. We can see them going to Resident Evil 0, even though I'm sure there's a lot of haters of that game. I personally like Resident Evil 0. So I think the over-the-shoulder mode definitely could be something that improves the game in a lot of ways, and could be a way where it still makes us veteran fans happy while still building upon and introducing new generation Resident Evil players. But number one absolutely goes to giving us a chance to get the canon ending of Resident Evil 1. It bothers me so much that no matter what you do in the Resident Evil original game and the Resident Evil remake, that no matter what you do, you cannot get a canon ending. For those that do not know, the canon ending, and spoilers if you never played Resident Evil 1, which I don't know why you're watching this video if you haven't, but spoilers if you haven't played the Resident Evil 1 remake or original game. The canon ending is where 4 of the main characters all survive, basically. So Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, and Rebecca Chambers all escape on the chopper with Brad Vickers, and they reappear in future titles of the franchise or the movies. However, in the game, it's impossible to escape with all 4 of those characters. The most you can escape with is with Jill and Chris. Both Jill and Chris could both escape, but then if you're playing as Jill, you can only bring Barry with you, and if you're playing as Chris, you can only bring Rebecca with you. I don't know why this bothers me so much, but for some reason, it bothers me to no end that the canon ending deals with all 4 characters escaping the Spencer Mansion, and there's no story, no interaction, nothing you can do in the game where you can actually get the canon ending. And that bothers me to this day so much. And I feel like this is something that they can change and improve upon. Now, I'm not asking them to expand on the story to where instead of having Jill and Chris play the same story but different type of scenarios, they have 2 separate stories that actually connect, because they didn't even do that with Resident Evil 2 remake technically. What I'm asking is this final way to where Chris can somehow find Barry near the end and bring him on the chopper with him, or Jill can somehow find Rebecca near the end. Or I think an easy solution, in my opinion, is just have Rebecca or Barry, depending on if you're playing as Jill or Chris, Rebecca or Barry in the cell with the other character. So for example, if you're playing as Chris, you can find Jill locked up in a cell because Wesker locked her up. But if you're playing as Chris, Rebecca's part of his main story. However, Barry is not part of the main story at all. Why do they not make it to where you can find Jill and Barry locked up in the cell, and then it's an easy fix? Boom, just like that, you've now fixed a situation where you can now get a canon ending where all 4 of them can escape. Same thing with Jill. If you're playing as Jill, you can find Rebecca and Chris locked up together. I think it's an easy way where you can find all of the characters, escape with all of them without changing the story, without making sure that they each have 2 separate stories that have to interact with each other. You don't have to worry about that. You can just focus on just what you've done with the original and the remake, where they play stories and it's different based off of which character you select. However, near the end, instead of just finding the other protagonist in the cell, you find their partner in there as well, rather that be Barry or rather that be Rebecca. And this is very important when it comes to the Resident Evil franchise, because the problem is that these characters pop up in other Resident Evil games and movies. For example, we see Rebecca in future movies like Vendetta, or the new one that's coming out, Death Island. And then we see Barry in a new game, Revelations 2. So the canon ending is that both Barry and Rebecca and Jill and Chris all survive. And I think it's important that Capcom makes it to where you are able to achieve the canon ending for Resident Evil. But that's gonna do it for this episode of Nerd Space, guys. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button if you really enjoyed this video, or the dislike if you did enjoy this video. Also, guys, if you want to see my Resident Evil 4 remake review, it's a 5-minute review. You can go check that out real fast, or you can check out this other video which kind of showcases my top 10 survival horror games I'm excited for that release in 2023. Anyways, let me know in the comments what you guys think about this list. Do you think Resident Evil 1 remake deserves yet another remake, or do you think they should just stay away from it, don't touch it, leave it alone, and move forward? I'd love to know what you guys think in the comments, but as always, I'll see you on the next Nerd Space. Take care.